Hey guys, Brian here from Great Lakes Backpacker, and today what I want to do is talk a little bit about something that's intrigued me for several years now, and that is stoves. Now, I'm not talking about this kind of stove, I'm talking about these kind of stoves. And what these are alcohol backpacking stoves. And I first came across this whole concept several years ago when I was looking at stuff on the internet. I don't think I was even searching for this stuff at the time because honestly I didn't even know these kind of things existed. But I came across a couple websites that looked really interesting, and the more I read about them and looked into them, I thought it was something that maybe I'd want to try and play around with. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to say up front that I am by no means an expert on backpacking alcohol stoves. It was simply just something that was intriguing to me, and I kind of experimented with a couple different kinds, basically just these three different designs. And if you look around on the internet and do any kind of research into it, you're going to find that there are dozens and dozens of different designs and concepts and ideas with these types of stoves. I simply just want to talk about the three types that I've experimented with, and basically to just explain why I think one of these is better than the others, at least in my personal experience. Okay, so why would anyone want to try and experiment with something like this for backpacking? For me personally, one of the big reasons was for trying to save weight in my backpack. Typically my backpack weighs between 40 and 45 pounds, and while that may not seem over the top, I've always wanted to try and trim the weight down a bit, and using one of these stoves was an interesting option that I was willing to try out. Now, another reason may be for simplicity's sake. There's really nothing to these stoves except for a container that you fill up with alcohol and put a match to it or some kind of a flame to it to get it to start. So unlike traditional canister stoves where you simply screw the burner assembly on and light a flame and use it to cook your food and don't have to really worry too much about cooler weather, these things can sometimes be a little finicky, especially two of these designs, which I'll get into in a little bit. So with that being said, let me go through each one of these stoves individually and explain a little bit about each one of them. Okay, so the first stove that I actually experimented with is referred to as a penny alcohol stove. And the reason it's called a penny alcohol stove is because you actually use a penny during its operation. And I found the design for this, again, online, and when I find the link I'll put it down below in the description. So this stove is actually made from a Heineken beer can, and what you do is you cut the beer can in a couple different pieces according to the directions, and then you fit one part inside of the other, and then you actually seal the seam with JB Weld, which is a two-part epoxy, and it's supposed to stand up really well at the high temperatures, so it worked fairly well for this application. And if you look real close along the outside edge here, there are, I believe, 6 jets that I drilled in there with a small drill bit, and then in the very center there's 4 holes. So then when you get ready to light the stove, what you do is you pour an ounce of alcohol into the center here through these 4 holes, and then it drains down onto the inside in the reservoir. And then when you get ready to light the stove, you simply put the penny on top to cover those 4 holes. And what that does is just to help keep some of the pressure inside there when the gas is vaporizing, and then it forces the flames out through the little holes on the perimeter there. Now, like I mentioned, these kind of stoves don't typically work well in cooler weather, and one of the sites that I saw that discussed penny alcohol stoves talked about building a little contraption like this. And basically what this does is it allows you to keep the stove off the ground so that it's not sitting in direct contact with the cold ground, and it insulates it a little bit. And this also serves a dual purpose. You can put some alcohol in this tray here and put a flame to it, and then put your stove on top of it, and what that does is to help heat the alcohol inside there and get it to vaporize quicker. Now with this type of stove, you don't actually put a pot directly on top of it, it'll smother the flame out, and so you need some kind of a stand for the pot to sit on, and essentially that's what this is. I just found small diameter metal at Home Depot, and I cut it to length and bent it up, and then I use this as my pot stand. So when I use this stove, I put the stove on the inside and then set my pot on the top, and that's got just enough gap for it to not smother the flame. Now, another thing that alcohol stoves don't do very well is simmer. So unlike a canister stove where you can adjust the flame height and heat with a valve, these are either on or off. However, there are some designs out there for adding things called a simmer ring, and so basically what this is another part of a beverage container, and What you do with this is to put it right in here, and essentially that keeps the flame a little bit lower so that it doesn't have as much direct heat on your pot. Now, while I didn't invent this design for a simmer ring, I did find it on a website and someone mentioned that this seems to work very well for them. I unfortunately didn't have the same experience that that person did. It just didn't seem to work very well for me. Okay, so on to the second stove that I've experimented with. This one's referred to as a Fancy Feast stove, and that's because this container was actually from Fancy Feast cat's food. And essentially what you do is take the top off, remove the contents, and clean it out. And then what I did was I took a metal file and just kind of filed down this ridge on the inside so it wasn't too sharp. And then basically what you do is you drill some holes around the outside, and that essentially is it. Now, as is the case with a lot of DIY projects, there are a ton of different designs for this kind of a stove. And while it doesn't look like there's much you could do to modify something like this, there actually is. I've seen people experiment with 1 row of holes on here, 2, and sometimes even 3 rows of holes on a stove like this. Another thing I've seen people do is use different size holes. When I made this one, I used a 3/16 inch drill bit and put 2 rows of holes around here that were staggered, as you can see here. So now how you use this stove is you take an ounce of alcohol, put it in the middle, and put a flame to it. And when you've got a good flame coming out of the top here, you take your cook pot and actually just set it right on top of the stove. So unlike the penny alcohol stove, this one doesn't need a pot stand. You simply set your pot right on top of it. Now, this alcohol stove is not unlike many other alcohol stove designs that I've seen in the fact that it suffers from not producing a strong flame in cool conditions or when you put a cold pot on top of it. And basically the way these stoves work is you're relying on the heat from the flame to help vaporize the alcohol to continue to burn and produce the heat. And so what happens is if you put a pot or a stove like this on a cool surface, or you put a cold pot on top, these things act like a heat sink and draw the heat away from the flame so the alcohol doesn't vaporize as well. And in turn you don't get as strong of a flame, or if the conditions are cold enough, the flame may actually go out on you. Now, one of the ways I've seen people try and alleviate that kind of problem is to put something underneath it to insulate it. One of them is to maybe put a piece of tin foil underneath it before you start cooking, in the hopes that that will help direct some of the heat back up and keep the alcohol warm so it vaporizes better and doesn't flame out on you. The other way to do it is to maybe put it on something insulated like a piece of wood, either maybe a tree stump or a picnic table if there's one available. However, the only problem with that is you want to make sure that you're not going to scorch the wood or any plants or greenery around it. So as with any kind of cooking in the backcountry, you just want to take extra precautions when you use something like this. Okay, so let's move on to the third and final stove here. This is the last one that I've experimented with, and out of all 3 of the designs, this is the one that I like the most. This one doesn't seem to suffer from any of the problems that the other ones have, like putting a cold cook pot on top of it or working well in cold conditions. And this one has actually got 3 different parts. The bottom part here is also a Fancy Feast cat food can. Obviously there are no holes in this part though. The second part is the inner wick here, and this black stuff is actually carbon felt. The third part here is actually a tomato paste can. So what I did was I waited for my wife to make some lasagna one day, and I took the empty can and used it to make this stove. So the way you use this alcohol stove is you put your ounce of alcohol on the inside here, and there's some holes on the bottom of this tomato paste can that allow the alcohol to come out and get sucked up by the carbon felt wicking material. And you put a flame to the carbon felt up here, and the flame actually sucks the alcohol up and burns from this wicking material on the outside edge here of the tomato paste can. And then what you do is when you've got a flame going, you simply just put your cook pot right on top of here and boil your water or rehydrate your food. Now, from everything I've seen and read on the internet, this type of pot does not suffer from some of the same problems that the other alcohol stoves do in terms of cold conditions or cold cook pots being put on top of it. I actually used this stove during a backpacking trip last summer, and it worked flawlessly for me. The other 2 stoves I've used on backpacking trips as well. The one for me that seemed to work the worst was the cat food can, which was this design here. I had this on a kayaking trip in May, And the temperature overnight only got to 40-45 degrees, and when I put my pot on here in the morning to make some hot chocolate, the flame lasted for a minute or two maybe, and then it just flamed out, so it never even warmed my water enough to drink. First stove, the penny alcohol stove, I did have some success with that. I took it on a backpacking trip a couple years ago with my son and actually used it the whole trip. Now, it was a little bit finicky at times, and I also had to use more alcohol than I anticipated. Okay, so that about wraps it up. I've explained a little bit about each of the stoves here that I've experimented with, and like I said, this one is by far my favorite one. So I think what I may do, if there's a forecast in the near future here that calls for some really cold weather, I may actually put my stove, the alcohol, and a cook pot outside and try and experiment to show you how well this thing works in cooler conditions. It'll be a first for me. I've never actually done anything like that, but from what I understand, these things work really well in cold conditions. So stay tuned. Hopefully I'll be able to show something like that to you in the future. Take care.